This is part 4 of Unit 6, and today we're going to kind of finish up or wrap up the Civil War. We're going to talk about two topics. We're going to talk about African Americans fighting the Civil War, and then we'll do a little talk about Lincoln. Now, both of these topics we'll talk about more in class and do some things with them in class, but just a few notes today about those topics. Let's start with blacks in the Civil War. And the first thing you need to know is they did fight on both sides. They fought for the Union, and later on they'll fight for the South as well, although kind of that decision will be made kind of reluctantly by the South. You might remember we talked about in part 3 about the draft riots, and a lot of that was directed towards African Americans, and after that blacks then are going to be allowed to actually fight. They're going to be allowed to do combat. Prior to that, they were allowed only as supportive roles, supply people in building defensive structures and these kinds of things. But after the draft riots, when so many people were upset about being drafted, Congress then allowed them to be actually fighting in the war, not just soldiers, but doing actual combat things. And of course that just becomes or as a result of the fact that there were so many people that were reluctant or didn't want to go fight, and there were many African Americans that did want to fight, and so they just eventually allowed them to. Again, before they weren't really allowed. It was kind of a racial thing. They didn't think that blacks were capable, that blacks were dependable, could show the discipline. But the first real black combat unit was the 54th Massachusetts. And the movie Glory is all about that, if you've ever seen that. If you're looking for a movie to do for extra credit, Glory would be a good one. So the 54th Massachusetts was the first combat. And something interesting is the South basically issued a declaration saying if they caught African Americans wearing a uniform, that they would be thought as treasonous and they would be executed on the spot. And so African Americans had that hanging over them too. They were not going to be prisoners of war. They were going to be executed. And even though that was hanging over their head, that didn't stop blacks in the North. Many of them volunteered and joined and wanted to fight anyway, of course, to help end slavery, which is a main part of the war now. As I just kind of said a few seconds ago, most people in the North still, even though they're fighting to end slavery, still didn't see blacks as equal. Of course, we aren't going to get to that point for many, many, many more years. And some people would argue we still haven't gotten to that point today. But the African Americans were really upset about this. It's kind of a slap in the face, and that's going to be kind of a theme during the war and even after the war, when things aren't going to change dramatically right away, where African Americans are still going to be seen as inferiors in the South and in the North as well. In the North, it's going to be more subtle. They're not going to have a lot of outward signs of racism, but it's going to be made very clear that blacks don't do these sorts of jobs, that blacks don't live here or in this neighborhood, those types of things. And as you can see on the board, this caused many of the blacks to kind of just lose heart, and many deserted over this. They just felt kind of betrayed when they realized that they were still African Americans and still seen as inferior by many people. Even though they were allowed to wear the uniform and eventually fight, even that wasn't enough oftentimes to make them seen as equals in the eyes of people in the North as well as the South, which of course was a kind of, you can imagine what that was like. You're putting your life on the line, and the 54th Massachusetts, for example, fought very bravely in some of the engagements they were in before they were kind of decimated by casualties. And even that wasn't enough to convince some people that they were equal. And that's heart-wrenching. If you're fighting to end a war, that's slavery, and to make yourself equal, when you realize that the people that are helping you still don't see you as equal, that's kind of a big thing to overcome. In the South, the blacks are going to be used by the Army of the South. Initially, though, just for supportive roles, kind of like how they first were used in the North. Building a lot of defenses were what a lot of the blacks in the South were used. But when the South became very desperate, when they were running out of men, when their ranks were decimated by casualties, then they would eventually allow blacks to fight, but only very, very reluctantly. And there were a lot of people in the South that did not agree with this at all. And it was very controversial, the decision to do this, but it was just simply out of desperation. It was either do this or fail completely. This is their last hope, so to speak. And many African Americans did fight for the South in that regard when they were allowed to, and students often ask why. And that's because of that whole paternalism thing. Remember, not all slaves had, horrible masters that were very cruel and miserable. Yes, they were slaves, but they had grown up with these people and had grown up in this way of life, and it's all they knew. And so some of them were reluctant to leave that life, and some of them, just listened to their masters to the very bitter end, and were afraid sometimes if they didn't listen to what their master said. So there's kind of different motivating factors there as to why they did that. But mostly it's that whole paternalism thing. My master says this, my master knows best, and I formed a bond or relationship with him. He asked me to help, I'm going to do that. Some of them formed very close relationships, and so they were loyal to those right to the bitter end. And again, we're going to talk more about this in class, about African Americans in the war on both sides, and I have some clips and some readings, and we'll do some discussion. But that kind of sums it up, except at the very end we have the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery forever. And this is known as one of the Civil War amendments. There's three of them, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. We'll get to 14 and 15 in the next unit, which deals with Reconstruction. But the 13th was actually passed at the end of the war, towards the end of the war, which basically abolished slavery in the country officially forever. And that, of course, was seen as a very joyous occasion by African Americans and the African American community, that no longer slavery was going to be permitted. But as I kind of hinted at earlier, it's also going to be a hollow victory when they realize that just because slavery's ended doesn't mean that they're going to be treated as equal, because that's going to take a lot longer, and some people say we're still not there. No study of the Civil War would really be complete without talking about Abraham Lincoln. If you ask people to rank the presidents, Abraham Lincoln is usually given number one. If not, he's in the top three for sure, often with interchangeable sometimes with Washington, and sometimes Teddy Roosevelt or FDR or some of those people are in there too, but usually Lincoln is right towards the top. And we're going to spend a day studying a little bit about Abraham Lincoln and what he was like as a president and as a person, and do some readings and some discussion on him. And he's in our seminar as well a little bit, but we'll talk a little bit more. But there's some things that we should know in general about Abe Lincoln. Literally, actually, he was born very, very poor in a long log cabin in Kentucky. And so he grew up in the South and around people that had slaves, and that had a dramatic impact on him kind of early on. And one of the things that's confusing about Lincoln is, what did he really think about slavery? Was he really against slavery or not? And that's just up to debate by historians, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. But basically, his stance very early on was that slavery was wrong. He didn't like it. He was sinful. That's what most historians think. But that view was too extreme for the time he was living in, and so he adopted the idea that was more common, which is, I don't like slavery expanding into the territories, which was usually what he said politically. But most historians, or a good chunk of them anyway, say that he was really against slavery from the get-go, and that is due back to what he saw as a youth. His family packs up and moves to Illinois, and so when he's young, he's growing up in a free state. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, you don't think this about Abraham Lincoln, and you don't think about it in studying as usual, but people thought very early on that he was kind of a lazy youth or non-productive because he spent a lot of time reading books, which today we would generally think is a good thing. But in those days, it was thought as a bad thing because you needed people that, did things. The whole West was settled by people that were doers and people that, cleared fields and did physical work with their hands. They had to make the roads and shape the West. And Lincoln was someone that was really content to kind of study on his own. And in fact, he taught himself the craft of being a lawyer. In those days, you just kind of had to study on your own sometimes. You didn't have to go to law school and pass the test. You basically just had to prove that you could do it, and you were allowed to be a lawyer. So he taught himself to be a lawyer, and he also was a shopkeeper for a while, which is where he got the nickname Honest Abe, because one day, according to legend anyway, someone left some change. They didn't take their change after their purchases, and he walked miles to return it to her when he could have just pickpocketed it himself, and so forth. And that's supposedly, according to legend, where Honest Abe came from. He first starts as a congressman. That's when he first kind of gets his taste into politics. He gets elected to Congress and gains notoriety during the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, which I've mentioned in class a little bit. The main focus of their debates was over the issue of slavery, and that's the first time really he goes on record as saying that he's against slavery. And again, this is kind of where it gets kind of confusing as to what Lincoln's views on slavery really were. Was he using slavery just as a political tool to get ahead, or what did he really think slavery was a sin or an abomination, which is a lot of historians think? It's really gray, and it's not really clear, but you should have some idea of what the Lincoln-Douglas debates were about. And it was focused a lot on slavery in the territories. Those are pretty famous. And Douglas was a very seasoned politician, and Lincoln going up to him was thought to be kind of like a lamb going to slaughter, or David versus Goliath. But it made Lincoln famous because he held his own against Douglas, who was a much more experienced politician and much better at speeches. But Lincoln used his dry wit and was very good at public speaking himself, and so that's why they became pretty famous. Remember, you're dealing at a time where this is kind of entertainment for people. They don't have, other forms of entertainment handy. They don't have, radio or TV or things. This is what entertained them, is kind of these people going back and forth, and that's what spread around, that Lincoln had these different debates and he could hold his own. It was entertaining to people to see these two politicians go back and forth. Excuse me. Lincoln's also very much a puzzle as president, because, as a lot of presidents tend to do, he flip-flops on a lot of issues. This slavery being one of them, where is he for or against, or is he against the South, or does he understand the South? Another common example is he seems to be against rebellion, but when there's an uprising of Indians during the Civil War in the Minnesota Territory, he pardons most of them, all but a few of them, because he understands their plight. So he's kind of hard to read a lot, because he seems to say one thing and do another. But a lot of that changes just as he becomes more mature too, and as he has more experience, he changes his position on some issues. But I guess my point being, it's hard to get our hands on who really Lincoln is, and there's a lot of people that have tried, because he does seem to say different things at different times. As far as abolition goes, again, this is something that historians kind of theorize, that maybe the reason why he didn't come out and say right away that abolition is where we need to be and slavery was wrong and we need to end it immediately, is he knew that that was too radical of a view, that wouldn't stand or sit very well with a great number of people. People need to change gradually or slowly over time. As I mentioned before, Lincoln is a great study of books or history, and he knows that people don't change overnight, that it's a slow, gradual process. And so a lot of historians say that he was pretty crafty or sly on the position of slavery, and he pushed people gradually because that's, what probably had the best chance of success. Ultimately, his goal may have been to end slavery, but he couldn't do that right away. He had to do it slowly over time, which is why he said, I'm going to end slavery in the territories, and then he goes to the Emancipation Proclamation, which frees people, or free slaves in some of the states, but not all of them. And then later on, he's going to be more vocal about slavery in being abolished in general. Remember, Frederick Douglass was one of his close personal advisors and often advised him on the issue of abolition and slavery and free blacks and things like that as well. And we know that Douglass was, of course, a staunch abolitionist. So if Lincoln has him as a close personal advisor, we could probably safely assume that he was pretty comfortable with Frederick Douglass's views and had similar views himself. Okay? Just a couple final things here. It's interesting to note that the Lincoln family itself had kind of some mental health issues. His wife, Mary Todd, was very much rumored to be kind of cuckoo. She often conducted seances in the White House to try to connect with dead people. They had a lot of tragedy strike them young. Their children died as they were young, and she often was trying to get in touch with them. She was very much over the top. She's someone that didn't deal very well with grief, and there's lots of stories out there about how she was kind of on the edge all the time and not there. But Lincoln himself was rumored to be kind of bipolar because he often suffered from highs and lows. He really probably suffered from severe bouts of depression. He was often, there's stories of the Civil War, how he would stay and read the reports of the battles and all the guys that were dying, and just, you could almost tell it in his face and his body language, how much to heart he took it. And so there's really a lot of highs and lows, and if you look at pictures, this is a good thing historians like to do, the impact of the presidency on Lincoln physically. Look at the first pictures of him as president and the years after the Civil War's been going on, and you can just tell he's totally aged, he's tired, you can see it in his face and his eyes that it's taken a toll on him. But there's lots of reports that he's kind of goes up and down an awful lot during his presidency with highs and lows, which is consistent with bipolar disorder. Of course, what we probably most know about Lincoln is that he is killed by John Wilkes Booth, who was a Southern sympathizer. And the most ironic part of this is that it takes place shortly after the war is ended. And Booth kills Lincoln with the hopes that will restart the Civil War with Lincoln. Then he hopes there's a lot of people that have views like him that will take to fighting again, and he makes the comment that the South shall rise again. And when he jumps off the stage, he makes a Latin phrase statement that is death to tyrants. So it kind of indicates that he thinks that Lincoln is kind of tyrannical. And there's lots of good stories about this. We'll look at some of this. It's kind of interesting to look at the connection between Lincoln's assassination and Kennedy's assassination. But you probably are familiar too that Lincoln supposedly had visions that he was going to die, and he went to Ford's Theater anyway to see the play, and of course he was killed, and he becomes basically, as I have here, that's what elevates him to a legend in American history, because he's killed, and he's killed in such a way that he is seen as a martyr. Remember, he held the nation together during the most critical time. The country could have blown apart. He could have let the South go, but he chose to fight, and many times it looked like the North had no chance of winning, but he held together, he held his beliefs, and in the end he wins, and he holds the country together. And that endears him to a lot of people, and even a lot of people in the South may not like Lincoln, but they respected him for what he was able to do and accomplish, because it was no easy task doing what he did and going through what he did go through. And there's lots of things that we could talk about and learn about Lincoln. He's a fascinating person. There's lots of books out there, and again, we're going to do a little bit more on him in class, where we see some videos and we do some reading and some discussion on him. So we'll add to that. So this is kind of the end of part 4 of Unit 6, talking about, again, the role African Americans played in the war, and a little bit about Abraham Lincoln.